Two rulers sit across a polished table. The candles flicker. Quills are dipped in ink. Parchment is pressed flat. And then, with the full weight of ceremony, both men sign. Hands are shaken. The room exhales. The diplomats call it peace. Machiavelli would call it a trap. In the 16th century, while the rest of Europe was writing poetry about honor, loyalty, and the nobility of sworn oaths, one Florentine civil servant was doing something far more dangerous. He was watching. He sat in the chambers. He carried the letters. He read between the signatures. And after decades of watching kings, popes, and warlords make and break agreements, Niccolò Machiavelli arrived at a conclusion that the powerful did not want spoken aloud. Some treaties, he believed, are never meant to last. Not because the men who sign them are uniquely evil, but because the treaties themselves are built on a foundation that cannot hold. They are designed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by political necessity, to fail. And today, 500 years after Machiavelli put his pen to paper, we are going to find out exactly how he knew that, and why it still matters every time you watch world leaders shake hands on a stage. Before we can understand what Machiavelli said about treaties, we have to understand who he actually was, because history has done him a profound injustice. Say his name today, and most people picture a cold, scheming villain whispering dark advice in the ear of a tyrant. The word Machiavellian has become synonymous with manipulation, deception, and moral emptiness. But that reputation is almost entirely wrong. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469, the son of a lawyer, and he spent the most important years of his life not as a power-hungry schemer, but as a public servant. For 14 years, he worked as a senior official and diplomat for the Florentine Republic. He was sent on missions to France. He met the Holy Roman Emperor. He negotiated with the ferocious Cesare Borgia. He watched Pope Alexander VI maneuver the church like a chess grandmaster. Machiavelli was not dreaming up ruthlessness in a dark room. He was observing it, carefully and systematically, in the brightest rooms in Europe. When the Medici family returned to power in 1512, he lost his position, was imprisoned, briefly tortured, and exiled to his small farm outside the city. It was there, stripped of influence and desperate to regain relevance, that he wrote The Prince. And here is the key to understanding that book. He was not prescribing how politics should work. He was describing how it actually did work, with a clarity that made the powerful deeply uncomfortable. One of his most unsettling observations was about treaties and diplomatic agreements. Not that all of them were dishonest, but that the structure of political life made treaty breaking almost inevitable, and that a ruler who did not understand this was already at a disadvantage. A prudent ruler cannot keep his word when keeping it would work against his interests and when the reasons that made him give his word no longer exist. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Prince. So what exactly does Machiavelli mean? And what does a treaty built to fail actually look like? He never wrote a checklist, but if you read closely across The Prince, the discourses, and his diplomatic dispatches, a pattern emerges. Agreements that collapse tend to share 4 structural weaknesses, and recognizing them is the key to everything that follows. The first is vague language that means different things to different parties. When a treaty uses phrases like mutual respect, appropriate measures, or reasonable restraint, Without defining what those words actually mean in practice, it leaves the future open. Each side walks away believing the agreement says what they wanted it to say. That gap between interpretations does not heal over time. It widens, and eventually it becomes the fault line along which everything cracks. The second is the absence of any enforcement mechanism. Machiavelli was blunt about power. Words on paper, no matter how elegantly crafted, carry no weight on their own. An agreement is only as strong as the consequences attached to breaking it. Remove the sword, and you remove the agreement. A treaty without enforcement is not a peace. It is a pause. The third, and perhaps the most dangerous, is when one party signs under duress. This happens more often than most people realize. A weaker state, cornered by military pressure, economic collapse, or diplomatic isolation, signs a treaty not because it believes in the terms, but because it has no other option at that moment. Machiavelli understood the logic of this completely. A prince who signs under weakness will seek to escape that weakness the moment he can. It is not betrayal, it is survival. And the agreement, signed in desperation, carries within it the seed of its own reversal.
The fourth weakness is disproportionate terms, when one side gives far more than it receives. Humiliation is a slow-burning fuel. A people or a nation that feels stripped of dignity by the terms of an agreement does not forget. They may comply for years, for decades even, but the resentment compounds. And when conditions shift, that stored grievance becomes the justification for tearing up every page of the original deal. 4 weaknesses: vagueness, no enforcement, signed under duress, lopsided terms. Machiavelli did not invent these observations. He distilled them from watching the world as it actually operated. And once you know what to look for, you begin to see these patterns everywhere. There is a famous passage in The Prince where Machiavelli describes 2 animals that every ruler must learn to imitate. The lion, he says, cannot protect itself from traps. The fox cannot defend itself from wolves. A prince must therefore be both, using strength when strength is needed, and cunning when cunning is required. Treaties are the domain of the fox. Machiavelli watched this play out in real time in agreements that he personally witnessed or helped negotiate. Take the Treaty of Granada in the year 1500, when France and Spain secretly divided the Kingdom of Naples between themselves. Both powers signed with full ceremony. Both powers congratulated themselves on their diplomatic achievement. And within 2 years, they were at war with each other over the very territory they had supposedly agreed to share. The treaty was never a peace. It was a coordination device, a way to eliminate a common rival together before competing for the spoils. Both sides knew it. Both sides smiled and signed anyway. Machiavelli observed this and drew the logical conclusion. In an international system with no higher authority, no Supreme Court of Nations, no enforcement body with real teeth, agreements between powers are ultimately grounded in interest and power, not in morality or obligation. When the interests align, treaties hold. When the power shifts, treaties break. And when a cunning ruler sees the moment arriving, they do not wait for the other side to act first. They act, and they justify it afterward. This is the deepest level of what Machiavelli was warning about. Not that rulers are unusually wicked, but that the structure of the international system itself creates pressure toward treaty failure. A good man in a bad system still has to survive the system. The fox signs the treaty. The fox breaks the treaty. And the fox who understands this reads every agreement with entirely different eyes.
Machiavelli gave us the framework. History has given us the case studies. And when you apply his lens to the major treaties of the last 5 centuries, the failures become almost predictable. Consider the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the devastating 30 Years' War and is often credited with creating the modern system of sovereign nation-states. It was a genuine achievement, but within its architecture were all the unresolved tensions that would fuel the next century and a half of European warfare. The vagueness of its religious provisions, the lack of any mechanism to enforce its borders, the resentment of powers who felt they had received too little, all of it was there, baked in from the first day. Consider the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which officially ended the First World War. Here, Machiavelli's 4 failure conditions were present with almost textbook precision. Vague language about war guilt and reparations that meant different things to different parties. Enforcement dependent on the willingness of exhausted victors who would soon retreat into isolation. Terms that humiliated an entire nation so completely that the resentment became the foundational grievance of the next catastrophic war, and a Germany that signed not because it accepted the terms as just, but because it had no army left with which to resist. The Treaty of Versailles did not cause the Second World War in the simple, direct sense. History is always more complicated than that. But Machiavelli would have looked at its architecture and told you with quiet certainty that this agreement was carrying its own destruction inside it from the moment the ink dried. Or consider the countless colonial-era agreements signed between European powers and indigenous nations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Many of those treaties were signed under conditions of overwhelming duress. Many used legal language that one party could not fully interpret. Many delivered almost nothing to one side and almost everything to the other. Machiavelli's framework does not excuse those agreements, but it explains exactly why virtually every one of them eventually collapsed into conflict. The pattern does not lie. Architecture determines destiny.
Now here is the question that matters most. It is 2024. We have the United Nations. We have the International Criminal Court. We have international law, sanctions regimes, treaty organizations, arbitration panels, and a vast global infrastructure of diplomatic institutions. Surely, after 5 centuries of practice, we have solved this problem? The honest answer is partly. The institutional architecture that has grown up since 1945 has genuinely improved the durability of some agreements. Mutual defense alliances with real teeth have kept certain peace. Trade agreements with binding dispute mechanisms have held longer than Machiavelli might have expected. The formal machinery of international law has made certain violations more costly than they once were. But the underlying dynamics have not changed. They have simply been dressed in more sophisticated language. Look at arms control agreements where verification mechanisms are chronically underfunded because the signatories quietly prefer a system they cannot actually monitor. Look at climate accords where the commitments are voluntary, the timelines are indefinite, and the enforcement mechanism is essentially public embarrassment, which turns out not to be a very powerful sword. Look at peace agreements brokered under intense international pressure, signed by leaders who face furious domestic opposition the moment they return home, and who will be replaced by someone who never signed anything at all. The form looks legitimate. The architecture still has the old failure patterns written into it. Machiavelli's warning is not cynicism. It is a diagnostic tool. And if you want to evaluate the durability of any agreement you read about in the news, his 4 questions are still exactly the right ones. Who had real leverage at the table and who was cornered?
What actually happens when one side violates the terms? Who enforces it, and at what cost? Does the language leave room for convenient reinterpretation later? And when the dust settles, does one side walk away with dramatically more than the other? If those answers trouble you, pay attention, because the failure of that agreement will not come as a surprise to anyone who asked the right questions at the beginning. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the heart of everything Machiavelli wrote. He was not telling us that peace is impossible. He was not telling us that diplomacy is pointless, that all rulers are liars, or that agreements between nations are nothing but theater performed for a credulous public. He was telling us something more precise and ultimately more useful than any of that. He was telling us that a treaty is only as durable as the conditions that make it in both parties' interest to keep it. When those conditions hold, the agreement holds. When those conditions change, and they always change eventually, the parchment is just parchment. The most dangerous agreements in history were not always broken by villains with cold hearts. Many were broken by systems, by vague language that allowed the powerful to reinterpret at will, by missing enforcement mechanisms that left violations cost-free, by power imbalances that made one side feel the agreement was imposed rather than chosen, and by humiliations that had no legitimate outlet except eventual rupture. Machiavelli saw all of this clearly. He wrote it down honestly, and he was hated for it by people who preferred comfortable illusions to accurate maps. But the map he drew is still accurate. The terrain has not changed as much as we like to believe. The lesson he left us is not despair. It is clarity, because the first step toward building agreements that actually last, durable peace, genuine cooperation, treaties worth the wax on their seals, is understanding with clear eyes exactly how and why the fragile ones fall apart. He warned us 500 years ago. Every time you watch leaders sign a document on a stage with the cameras rolling and the handshakes exchanged, remember to ask his questions, not because you want the agreement to fail, but because asking the right questions at the beginning is the only honest way to give it a chance of surviving. Machiavelli was not the villain history made him. He was the one telling the truth in a room full of people who had decided the truth was inconvenient. 5 centuries later, that room still exists, and the truth is still inconvenient. But it is still worth hearing.